Right now, somewhere in the world, a man is sitting beside a woman who has just asked him a question. It sounds ordinary, almost forgettable. He answers without much thought, maybe half distracted. What he doesn't realize is that in that moment, she may have just revealed far more than he understood. She didn't say it directly, she didn't spell it out, but something important was quietly expressed through the most everyday words, and he completely missed it. That man might be you. And if it has been in the past, this awareness changes everything going forward. Here's an uncomfortable truth most people overlook. When it comes to intimacy and emotional vulnerability, communication is often not fully direct. This isn't exaggeration, it's a pattern shaped by social conditioning. Many women grow up learning, consciously or not, that expressing desire or emotional need too directly can feel socially risky or exposing. So instead of stating things plainly, meaning is often carried inside everyday conversation. There is rarely a dramatic confession or obvious signal. Instead, meaning is embedded inside ordinary sentences that appear harmless on the surface. Unless someone recognizes that deeper layer, they will only respond to what is spoken, not what is actually meant. Research and communication studies shows that women are more likely to use indirect speech in emotionally sensitive contexts. When emotional closeness or intimacy is involved, it is often not presented in literal language. It is wrapped in questions, soft statements, or casual remarks carrying deeper emotional intent. This is where misunderstandings begin. One person hears only the surface, the other is communicating on multiple levels at once. And the key point is this: it is not about vague signals or guessing body language. It often comes down to specific moments where certain questions appear in conversation, and those questions carry more meaning than they seem to. Before identifying them, it's important to understand why questions are used instead of direct statements. From a young age, many girls are socially conditioned to be expressive in a careful way, open but not too forward, interested but not overwhelming, engaging but not exposed. Over time, communication becomes more subtle. Instead of stating feelings directly, questions become a safer way to explore emotional space. In other words, a question is not always about information. Sometimes it is about emotional safety. Psychologist Deborah Tannen highlighted this difference in communication styles. Men often lean toward clarity and facts, while women often prioritize connection and emotional alignment. In this context, questions become invitations, not just for answers, but for emotional connection. So when a woman asks something, she may not simply be seeking information. She may be checking presence, emotional availability, and whether the other person is truly engaged beyond the surface. This is also why relationships sometimes collapse in confusion. One side sees normal conversation, laughter, and time shared. The other may have been extending subtle emotional openings that went unrecognized. Over time, this creates distance neither fully understands until it becomes obvious. Because emotional closeness rarely disappears suddenly, it fades when small bids for connection are repeatedly missed. Relationship research by John Gottman calls these emotional bids, small attempts to connect. What matters is not the size of the moment, but whether it is acknowledged. Long term studies show that couples who consistently respond to these bids maintain stronger relationships than those who ignore them. And many of these bids do not look emotional at all. They look like questions. One of the most overlooked is simple: what are you thinking right now? On the surface, it seems like casual conversation. But in context, it is not about the exact content of your thoughts. It is about access, an invitation into your internal world. It is not a request for information, it is a request for closeness. Because when someone shares what they are thinking in a present, vulnerable moment, the conversation shifts from external exchange to shared inner space. That is where intimacy begins. Most people miss this and respond briefly or dismissively, not realizing a connection was being offered. When repeated, this doesn't create immediate conflict. It creates quiet emotional distance. Research in psychology also shows that emotional safety plays a major role in intimacy, especially where emotional context strongly influences desire. Feeling seen and emotionally received often matters as much as attraction itself. So when a question like this appears, it can be a small opening. Whether it deepens depends entirely on how it is received, but this is only one layer. Another commonly missed question is, are you tired? On the surface, it is care, a simple check in. And sometimes that is all it is. But in moments of growing closeness, it can shift. It becomes less about fatigue and more about availability, not just physical, but emotional. Whether the moment continues or ends, whether presence is still there or slowly withdrawing, it is a soft, indirect way of sensing continuation without forcing clarity, a way of keeping emotional space open while reading the situation. Most answers stay surface level a little. No, I'm fine, without recognizing the deeper question being explored. In emotionally charged moments, it can quietly signal whether there is openness for closeness to deepen or whether the interaction is ending. Once you start recognizing this layer, conversations feel different, not because people change, but because you start hearing what was always underneath. And that is the real shift, not overanalyzing every word, but understanding that sometimes the most meaningful parts of communication are not stated directly. They are hidden inside ordinary questions. If you really pay attention, there are moments happening all around you that seem completely ordinary on the surface, but carry a second layer underneath. A man might be sitting with a woman who asks him something simple, nothing dramatic, nothing that feels important in the moment. He answers without much thought, maybe even half distracted. What he doesn't realize is that the real message was never in the words themselves, but in what those words were pointing toward. A subtle invitation, a quiet emotional opening. And in that moment, he responds only to the surface, completely unaware of what was actually being offered. That man could be anyone. And once you start noticing this pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee. Because in reality, emotional communication is rarely fully direct. It often arrives layered, indirect, and woven into normal conversation. Especially in sensitive moments, meaning is carried as much by tone, timing, and context as by words themselves. This isn't about mystery or manipulation, it's about learned communication habits. When people are not fully comfortable expressing emotional needs directly, expression naturally becomes more subtle over time, not hidden, but embedded inside everyday language. So, what is said is not always identical to what is being communicated. There is no dramatic confession or cinematic clarity. Instead, there are ordinary questions, casual remarks, and small shifts in tone that carry more meaning than they appear to on the surface. Communication psychology has long noted that people often use indirect language when dealing with emotional topics. Instead of direct statements, meaning is delivered through questions, implications, or soft prompts that allow expression without full vulnerability. And that is where misunderstandings often begin. One person hears the literal meaning while the other is operating on a deeper emotional level. To understand this, it helps to look at why questions play such a central role in emotional communication. From early life, many people learn to balance expression carefully, open but not overwhelming, honest but not exposed. Over time, this shapes a communication style where direct statements become softened into questions that allow emotional exploration without immediate vulnerability. A question creates space. It allows connection to be tested without fully revealing intent. This is the difference between information based communication and connection based communication. One is about clarity and facts, the other is about emotional alignment and relational safety. So, when a question is asked, it is not always about the literal answer. Sometimes it is about the reaction it produces, the tone, presence, and emotional availability behind it. This is also why relationships can break down without clear explanations. From one side, everything feels normal. From the other, subtle emotional signals may have been missed repeatedly. Small attempts to connect go unnoticed, not because they were absent, but because they were too subtle to be recognized. And over time, missed connection becomes distance. One of the clearest examples is a simple question: what are you thinking right now? On the surface, it sounds casual, but in certain moments, it carries something deeper. It is not about the content of the thoughts, it is about access. an invitation into an inner world. It is less about information and more about closeness. When someone shares what they are thinking in a vulnerable moment, the interaction shifts. It becomes shared internal space, and that is where emotional connection deepens. Many people miss this by responding only to the surface level, unaware of the invitation embedded in the question. When these moments are repeatedly overlooked, the impact is not immediate. It builds slowly. A quiet sense of emotional distance forms even while everything appears normal externally. Psychological research often describes this through the idea of emotional bids, small attempts to gain connection. What matters most is whether they are acknowledged. Acknowledgement builds closeness. Consistent dismissal creates separation. Another often misunderstood example is, are you tired? On the surface, it is a simple check in. But in quiet, emotionally present moments, it can also carry another layer. It is not only about fatigue, it can be about continuation, whether the moment is ending or still open. A soft, indirect way of checking emotional availability without forcing clarity. If the answer is yes, the moment closes. If no, the space remains open. What is really being checked is presence and willingness to continue sharing space. Because of its simplicity, most people respond only to the surface meaning and miss the deeper layer entirely. Timing also matters. These questions rarely appear randomly. They often show up in quiet, emotionally charged moments when interaction could naturally continue or end. When these subtle bids are not recognized, something gradual happens. Emotional signals go unanswered. Attempts at connection are missed. And instead of confrontation, withdrawal begins quietly, not dramatically, slowly. Relationship psychology often describes this as a cycle where one person reaches, the other misses, and eventually the reaching stops, not from lack of interest, but from emotional exhaustion. And in many cases, these small questions are among the final subtle attempts to create alignment before that withdrawal. So, when everything appears fine on the surface but distance appears later, it often reflects not absence of connection, but missed moments of it. When recognized, the response doesn't need to be complex. It only needs to be present. Answering honestly when asked what you are thinking creates connection. It signals engagement instead of distance. Responding openly when asked if you are tired keeps the emotional space open instead of closing it automatically. At its core, this is not about decoding people or overanalyzing words. It is about awareness, recognizing that connection is often offered quietly in ways that do not announce themselves. And when those moments are met with attention instead of assumption, the entire dynamic shifts. Because what is being communicated was never truly hidden, it was simply subtle. And once you learn to notice it, you realize it was always there. In the end, intimacy is rarely created through grand gestures or perfect words. It is built in the quiet moments when someone reaches for connection and feels genuinely seen. The smallest questions often carry the deepest meaning, and the people who learn to recognize them are the ones who create real emotional closeness. Sometimes, understanding a woman is not about hearing more, it is about listening more carefully.